Hi and welcome back. Alright, in my last video I gave an intro to Cisco ACI, and now let's look at what it takes to put a configuration onto Cisco ACI. Hi, my name is Rich. Welcome to the Rich Tech Guy channel, and as I said in my previous video, we talked about Cisco ACI and I gave a brief introduction to it. Now this time I'm going to go over setting the policy to ACI and pushing a configuration out to it. So because this is a part 2 and it builds on the content of the last video, if you haven't seen that previous video, go take a look at it right now, and I've got it linked up above there, and the other thing is I will link it down below. Also, while you're checking down below, go ahead and hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. Alright, in my last video on ACI, I talked about the APICs and how that is where all the policy is set. So when we're going to push policy onto ACI and do our configurations, we're going to do it through the APICs. Now there are 3 ways we can access the APICs within the Cisco ACI environment. And the first and the most common way of utilizing the APIC is what we're going to use in this video, which is going to be the web-based GUI. And in order to access it that way, you're just going to open up a web browser and you're going to point it at the IP address or the fully qualified domain name of the APIC, and you're just going to start configuring it that way. The next way we can access the APIC is through a CLI interface. And in order to access the CLI of the APICs, we would connect to it via SSH, and we're going to have a very NXOS style of CLI interface, and just something to be familiar for anybody in data center networking. The third way that you can access an APIC is for anybody who's interested in automation. The APICs are accessible and configurable via REST APIs. So if you're looking for ways to work with the ACI and automate your tasks through it, what you need to do is you go to the Cisco DevNet website, developer.cisco.com, and you can find all the resources there necessary on how to interface and configure your ACI environment utilizing the REST APIs. Alright, so when we're beginning to push our policy onto ACI, first thing we need to be aware of is the tenant. And the tenant is your main logical separator between different groups within your ACI network. And if you're managing resources for multiple customers, you would want each one of them in a separate tenant, because there is no cross-sharing among tenants, with one exception, which I'll get into in a minute. But if you're a managed services provider and you're supporting multiple customers, you want each one of them in their own tenants. Maybe you're just managing your own internal systems, but you want to separate out resources between different organizations within, or different groups within the organization. And so again, you would want to put that into the separate tenants. Now when you first start up ACI, you're going to have 3 preloaded tenants. And those will be the management, the infra, and the common tenants. Now, for the most part, just go ahead and ignore the management and the infra tenants. Those are handling your control plane and your management plane traffic, and you really don't want to touch them. Now, the thing I'd said earlier, how there's one exception to no cross-sharing between the tenants. Well, that would be your common tenant. So anything you place in the common tenant can actually be shared out amongst your other tenants. Now let's say, for example, you have a single route out to the internet and you want multiple tenants to have access to that route. So you could place that as an endpoint in your common tenant and then share that out amongst the tenants within your ACI configuration that need that external access. Alright, so let's take a look at setting up a tenant in ACI. We're going to take a look at the tenants in ACI, and we're going to actually set up a tenant here. So in the system, when you first log in, you're going to get this little dashboard interface here that's just giving you an overall view of what's going on in your ACI environment. Now when we want to go into the tenants here, as I had mentioned, there are the 3 tenants, the common, infra, and management. The common one, we can put stuff in there to share, and let's just ignore the infra and management. So let's add a tenant. This is pretty self-explanatory, so I'll create a new tenant. And there we go. We've got the tenant name added in here, and there's a bunch of other settings here. I can set an alias, I can provide a description for it, give it some tags, and I can even start assigning a VRF name to it if I've already got a VRF that I want to configure. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and click submit. All this stuff could really be set up later in our configuration. And right there I have my tenant created. All right, so now that we've created our tenant, the next thing we need is a VRF. Now VRF is essentially a layer 3 routing instance within the tenant. And if you're familiar with VRFs on, say, the legacy NXOS platform, we're essentially dealing with the same thing here. It's a logical separation of IP tables, IP address tables, or IP address spaces. And if you're looking at older versions of ACI, or if you're looking at material regarding older versions of ACI, you might find the VRF referred to as a private L3 network, which is what it was originally called, and then eventually Cisco got around to correctly naming it a VRF. Now, the thing to know about VRFs is that there must be at least one VRF per tenant. You can have more than one, but you do need a minimum of one. All right, so in creating the VRF and starting our networking path, once I'm inside my tenant here, what I can actually do is I can create a VRF in a couple of ways. One is I can actually go into the VRF area and I can actually just go to create a new VRF, or what I can do is I can just go into this networking folder, and I've got these options here, this VRF, bridge domain, L2, L3, common VRF, common bridge domain. And what I can do here in this is I can just grab that and drag it out into the area, and I can create this VRF that way. So I'm going to name it VRF01, and I can select some other values. I can begin to apply some BGP policy, some OSPF policy, but in this particular case here, I'm just going to go ahead and click submit, and I've got a VRF now. All right, so after we've got our layer 3 VRF set up in ACI, what we need to do is we have to include a bridge domain. And the bridge domain is essentially a layer 2 container, layer 2 forwarding domain for your broadcast domains. And when I see a lot of content about ACI and I hear people explain the bridge domains, one of the things that really kind of just irks me, and I'm going to go on a little mini rant here, is that they often explain the bridge domain as being like a layer, or like a VLAN. Well, the honest truth here is it's not like a VLAN. It is exactly like something else. A bridge domain in ACI is a VXLAN VNID. And so if you haven't watched my series on VXLAN, I'll link the first video up here. Go ahead and watch that. But once you understand VXLAN, this is why it really is crucial for VXLAN understanding to get ACI, is because you are really running this VXLAN network. And a bridge domain in ACI is a VXLAN VNID. Now, you must have at least one bridge domain per VRF within ACI. You can have more than one bridge domain, but you absolutely must have a minimum of one. As we're building out our bridge domain, we've got to populate it with a subnet. And subnet it's a subnet. It's an addressable IPv4 or IPv6 space that we've all grown to know and love back when we were studying for our CCNA and we're so young and innocent in the world of networking. Or if you're studying for your CCNA right now, you're going to know and love subnetting. So the subnets, when we're creating them in ACI, we have to define the default gateway address of the subnet and then provide the size of it. And when we create that subnet, what we're doing is we're creating switch virtual interfaces on the leaf switches in the ACI environment that are going to house that bridge domain and that subnet. And the other thing you want to do when you're creating a subnet is you want to create layer 3 external routing, so that way what is in that subnet can communicate to other subnets. This is just essentially basic CCNA level networking. You're just doing things a little bit differently inside of ACI. Now, you do need to have a minimum of one subnet per bridge domain, but you can actually have more than one subnet per bridge domain. This is why I've said earlier where a bridge domain, how people say it's like a VLAN. No, it isn't. It's a VXLAN VNID. And that's one of the things you're allowed to do is you can have multiple subnets within that space, within that bridge domain space. And when you do set that up, though, you're going to have one subnet be the primary subnet, and then all other subnets will be secondary subnets within the bridge domain. All right, so in creating the bridge domain, and also we're going to go ahead and creating the subnets in ACI, is what I'm going to do is I have the bridge domain icon here, and I'm going to go ahead and drag this down, and I can actually just put it right on inside this circle that I've got created around the VRF. And once I let go of the mouse click, it's going to create the window for me here where I can then enter in the name of the bridge domain. Now, I'm going to actually just go ahead and give the name of the bridge domain as its subnet IP range that I'm going to go ahead and put into it. So that will be is actually, I need to do an underscore just for the naming purposes. And then what I'm going to do is instead of just clicking OK and creating this, first thing you can also do, this is a regular bridge domain for FCOE type activity. You can create this FC, you can set up forwarding policies and so on and so forth. I'm going to go into the L3 policies, or the L3 tab here. And I'm going to go ahead and click on the plus sign next to subnets, and it's going to want me to create the gateway IP. So I'm just going to put that in a CIDR notation. So 192.168.20.1, and then I'm going to go ahead and say this is a /24 network. And at this point, I am going to click OK. Now, that is this bridge domain is now set up to the point where I can just go ahead and click OK, and it's going to load that out, and I've got this bridge domain configured, and I'm going to go ahead and create a couple more bridge domains before we move on, so the next time you see this, those will already be created. All right, now it's time to get into the fun part of ACI. That would be the application profiles. And this is where ACI begins to differentiate itself from a VXLAN environment or a legacy networking environment. And with the application profiles, what we're doing is we're essentially setting up a collection of EPGs or endpoint groups. And then we're going to define the policy between them. So when we have our endpoint groups, everything within the same endpoint group can actually be able to talk to everything else within that same group, but then nothing can talk between endpoint groups. And that's where we bring the application profile in to help define that. So you're going to want, say, if you've got web servers, and it's okay for the web servers to be in the same group and have the same policy applied, but then you're going to want your database servers in a separate group and a separate policy, and you don't want that unfiltered communication between them. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up that application profile, and then in that we've got the EPGs. So what are the EPGs? Well, a EPG is basically endpoints that are grouped together based on the same policy, hence the name endpoint group. And the endpoints would effectively be it could be a bare metal server, a virtual machine server. It could be a switch that is not an ACI switch, a legacy networking device. It could be IP-based storage, which you would want in its own endpoint group, and so on and so forth. So there's a wide range of what these endpoints are. It's just really anything that is connected to your network. Now, once we've got the endpoint set up, and the endpoint groups defined, that's where we have to create the contracts. And the contracts would define what kind of traffic is allowed to flow between them. So if we're looking at web servers, we want HTTPS traffic to travel from the outside internet to a web server. We want, for a database server running SQL, we would want something like TCP port 3306 running there. And that would enable the traffic for the SQL server. So that's where, when we set up the contract, we're going to set up a provider and a consumer. The provider is what is providing the data, and the consumer is what is consuming the data. So in the case of a web server going to get data from a database server, we are going to have the database server be the provider, and then the web server would be the consumer. Now, if we've got a web server going out to an external connection, that external connection is essentially going to be its own EPG. And that EPG would be the consumer, and the web server would be the provider. So let's show you what's going on in the creation of an application profile, and then we'll come back and I'll talk about some special stuff regarding things like firewalls and load balancers. All right, so let's walk through the process of creating a application profile and also defining some endpoint groups. So what we've got on the screen here is we have the networking that I've created, the VRF and the bridge domains, and I'm going to go ahead and right-click on Application Profiles, Create Application Profile, and I'm just going to give this a simple name here, My App, and with that, we're just going to go ahead and click Submit. I could actually go ahead and define EPGs at this point in time, but I'm going to show you the other way that we can do that going forward here. So now that I've got My App here, if I pull up My App, actually, let's go into the topology here. All right, so this is what I've got going on here is I'm going to drag the EPG icon into the field here to set up my first EPG of My App. And I'm going to go ahead and name this, I'm going to give it the name 20, which was the third octet of that bridge domain, which is what this is applied to. And I'm going to have a bunch of web servers in here, so I'm just going to go ahead and name it web. Nothing too special about how this is set up. And now I can go ahead and choose a bridge domain. So I need to go ahead and select the bridge domain, and I'm going to select that one that is 20.0. I'm going to go ahead and grab that one. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So now that I've got my EPG set up and I've got my EPG circle here, I'm going to go ahead and grab a VMware, as I've got some VMs and I want to associate those into the EPG. So once we get this set up here, I'm going to go ahead and, all right, I'm getting an error here, but I'm going to go ahead and select this My vCenter VMM domain. And at that point, I'm just going to go ahead and leave everything else as it is here. But I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And there we have that. So as I go through and I create some more EPGs, I can build out everything within this application profile. So now that I've got my EPGs defined and I've got endpoints, VM servers associated to those EPGs, I need to go ahead and set up some contracts to allow the conversation to take place and for communication to happen within my network here. Now in ACI, what we're going to do is we're going to grab this light blue circle with a C inside of it, as that's contract, and we're going to drag it over the provider first and then to the consumer. So this first one I'm going to set up is going to be from the database, which is this 22 dB, over to the application, the 21 app. And so as I mouse over it, it shows the arrows, and then it goes over to the app. It should have selected yeah, there we go. Okay, now it's selected the consumer and the provider. And I'm just going to go ahead and name this. It's going to be app to DB. And we've got this box here that says no filter and allow all traffic. So if I leave this box checked, it's going to allow all traffic between these two endpoint groups. It's almost going to be as if they're the same endpoint group. So that kind of defeats the purpose of even having the contract. So let's go ahead and open that up. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new entry for it. And I'm going to go ahead and name this as MySQL. And this is going to be IP traffic. It's going to be on a TCP protocol. The source port, we don't care. It's going to be whatever the application server does in some high number. But from the destination point perspective, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set that to 3306 as the from, and then also the to is going to be 3306. And there we go. We've created the filter for the traffic here, and then I'm just going to click OK. And I got to go ahead and click submit here, and that will refresh everything as we now have our app to database contract. And I can effectively go do the same thing here between the web server and the application server. And in this case, the application server is going to become the provider. And it's going to be a little slow. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click out for a moment and come back in, reload this topology screen here, and I'm going to go ahead and try this again. There we go. We've got our app server as the provider, web server is the consumer. That's showing up in the networks, and so it's going to be web to app. Again, I'm going to take away the no filter here. I'm going to add something here. HTTPS is specifically what I'm going to go ahead and use on here. And the ether type is going to be IP. The IP protocol is going to be we're going to go ahead and do TCP. Again, the source port and range, we're going to go ahead and set this up in HTTPS. And for the destination port, I'm going to specify port 443. And we're going to go ahead and set update. So this is now going to allow all HTTPS traffic from whatever port to the HTTPS destination. I'm going to go ahead and click submit on that. And now I've got my two contracts set up here. So this is effectively our application our application profile. And what we're going to do from here in a typical environment is we would actually then define, say from the web server over to perhaps some load balancing in a layer 4 through 7 server and service, or we just have it as a straight out onto the open web, so that way people can access the web server. All right, so there we have a completed, albeit basic, lab environment type of application profile. Now, what about things like load balancers and firewalls? And I've mentioned them throughout the video, and I've alluded to some special treatment for them. So what we could do with these devices is we could set them up as their own endpoints and put them in their own endpoint groups and define the contracts for how we're going to handle the traffic between them and the rest of our network. But that's a lot of heavy lifting, particularly in a firewall, as you're really going through the list of filters and traffic and so on and so forth. So what ACI has done is ACI has created something called a L4 through L7 services, also referred to as L4 through 7 services. And when we have those defined, we can actually identify a firewall or a load balancer or some other device out on the network that meets the criteria, and we can have ACI manage it. There's actually a compatibility list which Cisco maintains and updates continuously regarding not only Cisco, say, firewalls, but also other manufacturers' systems. And that would even allow for ACI to just go ahead and apply that policy through what's called a service graph on an L4 through 7 device. And so think of a service graph as really just sort of a specialized contract to handle the traffic either to or through one of these devices. Now, if you'd like me to go into more detail and demonstrate something like that, that's something I would absolutely be able to do on a upcoming video. Go ahead and comment down below any questions you might have regarding ACI or the setup of that. All right, there you have it. That is ACI policy defined. Now, if you want to do stuff to automate ACI, as I said earlier in the video, there are resources available on DevNet to utilize the REST API. I can also dive into a little bit of that in a future video if you would like, and even show you how ACI can actually help you out with that. You can actually go into ACI and you can pull up a JSON configuration of any element within ACI. Now, my next video that I plan to do about ACI will be around the extended topologies. And the ACI right now, what we've covered is great as long as you're inside the same data center. So what happens if you're going to go out beyond that data center? That would be the extended topologies for ACI. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and say, if you like this content, go ahead and hit that like button, and go ahead and also hit that subscribe button to keep track of more content such as this. And always keep improving, keep learning, keep studying, and thank you very much.